Before you count sheep, count mysteries.
Thousands of years before the Roman Empire, before the pyramids of Giza were completed, before written history could tell us who these people were, someone began building one of the most mysterious monuments on Earth. On the plains of southern England stands a circle of enormous stones known as Stonehenge. Some of the largest stones weigh more than 20 tons, while others were transported from locations hundreds of miles away. They were shaped, moved, raised, and positioned with astonishing precision by people who had no cranes, no engines, and no modern machinery. But Stonehenge wasn't built in a matter of years. It wasn't even built by a single generation. The monument was created over thousands of years, gradually transformed by different communities who returned to the same landscape again and again. Long before the stones we see today were standing, the site had already become a place of enormous importance. So who were these people? Why did they dedicate so much time and effort to moving gigantic stones across Britain? How did they transport them over enormous distances? And perhaps the biggest question of all, why they build Stonehenge in the first place? For centuries, people have suggested everything from ancient temples and astronomical calendars to mysterious lost civilizations and even visitors from beyond the Earth. But archaeology has uncovered something far more fascinating. The story of Stonehenge isn't simply about stones. It's about the people who move them. This is the story of how Stonehenge was really built. Long before the great stones were raised into the familiar circle we recognize today, the landscape around Stonehenge was already a place of enormous importance. The earliest known activity at the site dates back more than 5,000 years, to around 3000 BC. But at that time, there was no stone circle. Instead, the people who lived in the area created a large ceremonial enclosure made from earth, ditches, and banks. They dug a circular ditch into the chalk landscape and built an embankment around it, transforming an ordinary piece of land into something very different. This was the beginning of Stonehenge. The people responsible belonged to prehistoric farming communities who lived long before written records existed. They grew crops, raised animals, hunted, and traded across Britain. They had no cities in the modern sense, no written language that has survived, and no centralized empire capable of ordering thousands of workers to a construction site. Yet they were already capable of organizing enormous projects. The earliest monument at Stonehenge covered a huge area. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of burial activity, ceremonial gatherings, and large-scale movement of people around the site. It appears that this wasn't simply a place where people lived. It was a place people came to, and they may have traveled considerable distances to reach it. Over the following centuries, the site changed dramatically. Around 2500 BC, enormous stones began to appear at Stonehenge, transforming the earlier earthwork into the monument we recognize today. But even before those stones arrived, something remarkable had already happened. The builders had chosen this location for a reason. Stonehenge sits on the Salisbury Plain, surrounded by a landscape filled with other prehistoric monuments. Nearby are burial mounds, ancient pathways, ceremonial structures, and another enormous monument known as Dington Walls. Together, these discoveries suggest that Stonehenge wasn't an isolated construction project. It was part of a much larger ceremonial landscape. And that raises an important question. Why this place? Why did prehistoric people return to this particular landscape for generations? We can study the monuments they left behind. We can examine their tools. We can analyze their bones. We can trace where the stones came from. But we cannot simply ask the people who built Stonehenge what they intended. They left no written explanation, no blueprint, no inscription saying who they were or why they built it. Instead, we have to reconstruct their story from the evidence they left behind. And one of the biggest clues may be found not in the stones themselves, but in the people who were buried around them. For centuries, people imagined that Stonehenge was created by mysterious priests, ancient druids, or perhaps even a civilization that possessed knowledge far beyond its time. But the people who actually built Stonehenge were far more ordinary, and in some ways, far more impressive. They lived thousands of years before the Romans arrived in Britain. They left behind no written records, so we don't know what they called themselves or exactly how they organized their society. Archaeologists instead have to reconstruct their lives from settlements, tools, burials, pottery, animal bones, and the monuments they built. These were farming communities. They grew crops, raised livestock, hunted, and traded. Their technology was primitive by modern standards, but their society was capable of organizing enormous numbers of people for projects that could take generations to complete. And Stonehenge appears to have been one of those projects. Evidence from nearby settlements suggests that large gatherings took place in the area. At Dennington Walls, only a few miles from Stonehenge, archaeologists discovered remains of houses and enormous quantities of animal bones, including pig bones. The evidence suggests that people traveled to the area, gathered together, and participated in large feasts. This gives us an important clue about the builders. They weren't simply a small group of people living beside the monument. They belonged to communities capable of bringing large numbers of people together. And those people may have come from surprisingly far away. One of the most fascinating discoveries came from the human remains found around Stonehenge. Isotope analysis of some individuals revealed that at least some of the people buried there had grown up far from Salisbury Plain. In other words, people were traveling across prehistoric Britain and beyond to reach this landscape. But the biggest surprise came from the stones themselves. Stonehenge contains two major types of stone. The enormous sarsen stones, which form the most recognizable parts of the monument, came from the Marlborough Downs, roughly 20 miles north of Stonehenge. But the smaller bluestones came from much farther away. Once the stones had been quarried, the builders faced a problem that seems almost absurd when we look at Stonehenge today. Some of the sarsens weighed more than 20 tons, while the bluestones had to travel from Wales to southern England. And the people doing this had none of the machinery we would normally associate with moving something so enormous. But they didn't need modern machinery. They needed wood. Experiments have shown that large stones can be moved using wooden sledges and rollers, with ropes made from natural fibers. Instead of lifting a massive stone into the air, workers could place it on a wooden sledge and gradually drag it across the ground. With enough people pulling together, even an enormous block could be moved. Of course, that doesn't mean it was easy. A stone weighing several tons still requires enormous force. The surface has to be prepared, the route has to be planned, and hundreds of people may need to coordinate their movements. If the sledge becomes stuck, everyone has to stop. If the stone shifts unexpectedly, the entire operation could become dangerous. And this was only the beginning. The builders also had to move the stones across rivers, hills, forests, and uneven terrain. Some researchers believe waterways may have helped transport at least part of the journey, while others argue that much of the movement could have been achieved over land. The exact route taken by every stone remains uncertain. But eventually, the stones reached Salisbury Plain. Now came the most difficult part. How do you take a block weighing 20 tons? The answer appears to have involved a combination of ramps, pits, ropes, timber structures, and simple mechanical principles. Builders could dig a large hole beside the position where a stone needed to stand, then gradually pull the stone upright using ropes while allowing its base to drop into the prepared pit. Once the stone was standing, the surrounding earth and rubble could be packed around its base to keep it stable. It sounds simple, but imagine doing it with a stone several meters tall, without a crane, without steel, and without modern surveying equipment. Then they had to do it again, and again, and again. The builders didn't simply place stones randomly around the landscape. They created carefully organized arrangements, including massive horizontal lintels placed across the tops of the upright sarcens. Those lintels had to be raised several meters into the air. Archaeologists believe the builders may have used timber scaffolding, ramps, and levers to gradually raise them into position. Once the stones were aligned, they could be secured using carefully shaped joints carved directly into the stone. And this is perhaps one of the most impressive details about Stonehenge. The builders didn't just stack rocks. They carved the stones to fit together. They created mortise and tenon joints and tongue and groove connections, techniques more commonly associated with sophisticated woodworking. Except here, they were being used to construct a monument from enormous blocks of stone. Every stage required planning. Every stone had to be positioned correctly, and every mistake could mean starting again. Yet somehow, 5,000 years ago, they succeeded. But moving and raising the stones still doesn't answer the biggest question. Why would prehistoric people spend generations doing this? What was Stonehenge actually for? And what did the people who built it believe would happen there? From Wales. Some of them traveled roughly 140 miles before reaching Stonehenge. And this raises a remarkable possibility. The people who built Stonehenge may not have been a single isolated population. They may have been part of a much larger network of communities connected through travel, trade, ceremonies, and shared traditions. Stonehenge could have been a place where these different groups came together, a place where people traveled for ceremonies, for feasts, for burials, and perhaps to honor beliefs that we can only partially understand today. But knowing who the builders were still leaves us with an enormous problem. Even if thousands of people were willing to help, they still had to move stones weighing several tons. And some of those stones came from Wales, more than 100 miles away, without roads, without horses, without wheels, and without anything resembling modern machinery. So how did they do it? Before anyone could build Stonehenge, they had to solve a problem that seems almost impossible even today. The stones weren't simply lying around waiting to be arranged. Some had to be quarried, shaped, and transported across enormous distances before they could even reach the monument. The largest stones at Stonehenge are known as sarcens. These enormous blocks of sandstone can weigh more than 20 tons, and the largest are around 7 meters long. For decades, researchers debated exactly where they came from. Modern geological analysis eventually provided the answer. Most of the sarcens came from an area known as Westwoods, near Marlborough in Wiltshire, roughly 25 kilometers north of Stonehenge. That alone is remarkable. But the sarcens weren't the most distant stones at the monument. The smaller stones, known as bluestones, came from much farther away. From Wales. Some of the quarries are located in the Preseli Hills, in what is now Pembrokeshire. That's roughly 140 miles from Stonehenge by modern road routes. The journey the prehistoric builders actually took may have been very different, but either way, these stones had to travel an extraordinary distance. And researchers have discovered something even more interesting. The Welsh stones weren't simply random rocks collected from the landscape. Archaeologists have identified ancient quarry sites where people deliberately extracted particular types of stone. At one of these sites, evidence suggests that prehistoric workers created platforms and carefully removed sections of rock from the hillside. They weren't just breaking stones apart. They were quarrying them. This raises an obvious question. Why go all the way to Wales? There were plenty of rocks much closer to Stonehenge. The answer isn't completely certain. Perhaps the stones had symbolic importance. Perhaps the communities who lived in Wales had a special relationship with them. Or perhaps the stones themselves were considered sacred. Whatever the reason, someone decided they were worth transporting across Britain. And transporting them would have been an enormous undertaking. Imagine standing beside one of these stones 5,000 years ago. There are no trucks, no roads, no crans. No steel cables. No engines. Just wood, rope, stone tools, and human strength. A single mistake could damage the stone or injure the people moving it. And the journey wasn't simply a matter of dragging a block across flat ground. There were hills, rivers, forest, univers terrain, and eventually, the enormous construction site at Salisbury Plain. The builders somehow had to coordinate hundreds of people and keep the stone under control throughout the journey. But here's where Stonehenge becomes even more extraordinary. Archaeologists have discovered that the builders didn't necessarily need advanced technology. They needed something much simpler: engineering knowledge, teamwork, and an incredible amount of patience. Because once the stones reached the site, the hardest part was still waiting. They had to raise them, and somehow turn massive blocks of rock into a monument that would survive for thousands of years. After thousands of years, we can explain many things about Stonehenge. We know where many of the stones came from. We know that different generations returned to the site. We know they transported enormous blocks across Britain and developed surprisingly sophisticated methods for raising and connecting them. But one question remains much harder to answer. What was Stonehenge actually built for? There isn't a single answer that archaeologists can prove beyond doubt. Instead, the evidence suggests that the monument may have served several purposes over different periods of its history. One of the strongest clues comes from the way Stonehenge is aligned with the sun. At the summer solstice, the sun rises over a particular stone known as the heel stone and aligns with the central axis of the monument. At the winter solstice, the setting sun aligns with the stones in the opposite direction. This was not accidental. The people who built Stonehenge clearly understood the movements of the sun well enough to incorporate them into the design. But that doesn't necessarily mean Stonehenge was simply an ancient calendar. The monument also appears to have had an important connection with death. Hundreds of burial sites have been discovered in the surrounding landscape, and human remains have been found at Stonehenge itself. Some individuals appear to have traveled considerable distances before being buried there. That suggests the monument may have been connected with ceremonies surrounding death, ancestors, and the journey from life to whatever these people believe came after it. Then there's another extraordinary discovery. Researchers studying the remains of people buried at Stonehenge found evidence that some had grown up far from the monument. One particularly famous individual, sometimes called the Amesbury Archer, was buried with objects suggesting connections to continental Europe. Stonehenge was therefore not simply a local construction project. People were moving across enormous distances to participate in the culture surrounding it. And perhaps that was one of its greatest purposes, bringing people together. Imagine living in Britain 5,000 years ago. Communities were scattered across the landscape. There are no cities connecting everyone, no roads carrying thousands of travelers every day, no written newspapers, governments, or digital communication. A monument like Stonehenge could become a meeting place, a place where different communities gathered, a place for ceremonies, for feasts, for burials, for remembering ancestors, and perhaps for observing the movements of the sun and seasons that controlled almost every aspect of their lives. The monument may also have changed meaning over time. The people who began building it around 3000 BC were separated by centuries from those who later added the Great Sarsens and Bluestones. Stonehenge wasn't one single idea carried out by one group. It was a project that evolved. Generation after generation, people returned to the same place and changed what their ancestors had created. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part. We may never know exactly what Stonehenge meant to the people who built it, but we can see that it mattered enough for them to spend enormous amounts of time, energy, and resources creating something that would outlive them by thousands of years. And they weren't the only people doing this. Across Britain, other prehistoric communities were building enormous monuments of their own. So the next question becomes even more interesting. What kind of society was capable of building Stonehenge in the first place. Building Stonehenge required something more than clever engineering. It required people, a lot of them. For centuries, archaeologists wondered how prehistoric communities could organize such enormous construction projects without kings, written instructions, or anything resembling a modern government. The answer may be hidden in the landscape surrounding Stonehenge. Just a few miles away lies Donington Walls, one of the largest prehistoric settlements ever discovered in Britain. Archaeologists have found evidence of houses, pathways, enormous quantities of animal bones, and signs of large-scale feasting. The settlement appears to have been occupied around the same period when the great stones were being raised at Stonehenge. This changes the way we should imagine the builders. They weren't a handful of mysterious people dragging stones across an empty landscape. They were part of organized communities capable of gathering large numbers of workers and feeding them. And feeding those workers was itself a huge challenge. Moving a 20-ton stone requires strength. Moving dozens of them requires organization. But keeping hundreds or even thousands of people working together requires something even more important: cooperation. Someone had to decide where the stones would go. Someone had to organize the routes. Someone had to prepare the timber, ropes, sledges, and tools. Someone had to provide food. Someone had to know how to shape the stones and construct the joints. And all of this had to happen repeatedly over generations. There is also evidence that the people who built Stonehenge were connected to communities across Britain and beyond. Some of the bluestones came from Wales, while analysis of human remains suggests that people from distant regions traveled to the Stonehenge area. This means Stonehenge may have been more than a monument. It may have been a place where different communities came together. We still don't know exactly how their society was organized. There may have been influential leaders, religious specialists, skilled craftsmen, or groups responsible for coordinating the construction. But there is no evidence of an empire forcing thousands of people to work at Stonehenge. Instead, the monument may demonstrate something much more interesting. People were willing to cooperate on an enormous scale because the project had meaning. They were building something that would outlive them, something their children would see, and perhaps something their children's children would continue building. That may explain why Stonehenge took so long to develop. It wasn't a single construction project. It was a tradition, generation after generation. People returned to the same landscape. They moved stones. They rebuilt structures. They added new monuments. And they changed the meaning of the place while preserving its importance. Eventually, the monument we know today began to take shape. But the people who created it left behind no written explanation, no final message, no inscription telling us what they wanted future generations to understand. Only the stones remained, and those stones would survive long after everyone who raised them had disappeared. More than 5,000 years have passed since the first people began transforming the landscape at Stonehenge. The communities who built it are gone. Their homes have disappeared. Their languages have been forgotten. Their beliefs survive only through fragments of archaeology. But the stones are still standing. We now know that Stonehenge wasn't built by one mysterious civilization or by people with technology that somehow disappeared. It was created by prehistoric communities who had an extraordinary understanding of their environment, remarkable engineering skills, and the ability to organize enormous amounts of human effort. We know that some of the stones came from nearby Wiltshire. Others traveled hundreds of kilometers from Wales. We know that the builders used simple machines, timber, ropes, ramps, and an enormous amount of physical labor. We know that the monument was aligned with the movements of the sun, and that the surrounding landscape was deeply connected with burial and ceremonial activity. But despite everything archaeology has discovered, one question remains impossible to answer completely. What did Stonehenge mean to the people who built it? Perhaps it was a place for ceremonies. Perhaps it connected the living with their ancestors. Perhaps it marked important moments in the movement of the sun, and the changing seasons. Perhaps it served several purposes at different points in its long history. The truth is, we don't know. And maybe that's what makes Stonehenge so fascinating. The mystery isn't that ancient people somehow managed to build something impossible. The real mystery is that they built something so enormous, so carefully designed, and so important that people continued returning to it for generations. They knew that they wouldn't live long enough to see the entire story completed. Yet they built anyway. They moved stones they would never see finished. They created monuments their grandchildren would inherit. And thousands of years later, we are still standing in the same place, trying to understand what they were thinking. Stonehenge doesn't prove that ancient civilizations possessed secret technology. It doesn't require aliens. It doesn't require magic. It requires something far more human. People working together towards something they believed was worth building. And perhaps that is the most remarkable mystery of all. Because the people who built Stonehenge left almost nothing behind, except the stones. And somehow, the stones were enough.